My name is Jason.
My name is Tom.
And this is Fear of a Black Dragon, an old school RPG podcast.
And in this episode, 4 men ride out and only 3 ride back as we look at Devil Aim for Me.
Our first segment is Basic Crawl.
Devil Aim for Me is a 27-page Weird West incursion for Trophy Dark. It was written by Michael Van Vliet, with art by Tim Lilliefors and Rapid Punches, and layout by Natalie Ashe. From the back cover, they say that Bantam was shot dead and a lightning strike knocked him right back to his feet, alive again. They say the bullets ran out of the holes in his chest like prairie dogs fleeing a flooded burrow. They say he made a deal at the crossroads. They say a lot of things. They say there's a bounty on his head.
The contents of Devil Aim for Me. The book starts with a how to play section, which is just the rules for Trophy Dark, replicated so you don't even need a copy of Trophy Dark to play it, though I will note that those rules have undergone some changes since this was published. We don't concern ourselves with system on this program, so we won't have anything more to say about that section. Next is character creation. Here you have everything you need to create a Weird West flavored Trophy Dark character, occupations, backgrounds, drives, and rituals, which are called Becoming Myth in this scenario to make them better fit the setting. Next, we have a basic introduction to the scenario, which is, it's a bounty hunting thing. Then comes a section on moments, which are colorful bits you can sprinkle into the game wherever you need them and are a staple of trophy adventure design. Next, you have conditions, which are the magical and psychological effects your characters can suffer as they gain ruin. Then comes the adventure proper. Now, Trophy Dark incursions are divided into 5 rings, with each ring representing not only a physical or geographical progression within the adventure, but also a narrative progression, with each successive ring representing the character becoming more deeply enmeshed in the events of the incursion, until they reach Ring 5, when they are either going to be lost completely or radically changed, usually for the worst. Ring 1 is where the characters learn of their bounty, a legendary bandit called Henry Bantam. Ring 2 involves the hanging of an alleged witch, plus a number of environmental hazards to be overcome. Ring 3 is a downtime scene in town, where we learn more about the characters and what motivates them. Ring 4 is about overcoming a group of spectral miners just outside the mine where Bantam is hiding. And Ring 5 is the final confrontation with Bantam. The book ends with a copy of the character sheet. So let's talk about our bona fides. Tom.
I ran 1 session using the automotive Stay Frosty hack Gridlock of my own devising. So instead of being horse riding bounty hunters, the player characters were a trio of kind of Mad Max style road warriors traversing the Badlands. So similar vibe, but different transportation.
I never want to hear you talk about me adapting dungeons again. No, I have lots of questions about that, actually. I played it as a one-shot using Trophy Dark. Okay, so things we liked. Let's get some technical things out of the way. I enjoyed the artwork. There's actually a fair amount of it for a Trophy Dark incursion, which usually just has like 1 or 2 pieces of art. I think the cover is especially good. It really kind of gets you in the mood for what is going to be happening in this particular incursion. So I just wanted to throw out a little shout out to the quality and quantity of artwork. Other things that I really enjoyed. Try to think of high level things before we get into the nitty gritty. Oh, character creation is interesting here because I think that like when you are going to do a trophy thing, especially that is not in a fantasy setting, which the assumption of trophy is that you're in a sort of dark fantasy setting, the character creation goes a really long way toward delivering the genre or the setting that you're trying to do. And so I think when you stray out of that dark fantasy setting, it's really important that the character creation details help enforce that. They are like your best chance to convey at a player-facing level what it's like.
Sure, and admittedly, we're not supposed to talk about system things, so don't worry, listeners, we're not really, because actually the character creationness of this is your character hooks into, this is the setup for why you're doing the adventure. So for this, I used the occupations, not the backgrounds, because that was kind of taken care of by Stay Frosty mechanics, but the drives we did use, and actually every single player, to my surprise, managed to kind of mention their drives several times over the course of of the session and really lean on it. Because I find that actually with pre-gen or semi-pre-gen characters, that sometimes that doesn't really happen. People look at the drive once, forget about it. But in this case, I think, especially because it's a good list of classic, quite dark Western stuff, like you want to get a packet of land, you're basically depressed, so you're just trying to fight. Is it a taste of heaven on earth, I think is the phrase.
Right.
So they're very well selected. You could have an existing campaign and just get people to pick from this stuff anyway when you begin this adventure, if you wanted.
Yeah, drives are a really, really key part of, well, definitely a key part of the trophy experience, but I could also see it being very helpful, just generally speaking, in a 1 or 2 shot environment, no matter what kind of system you're using. Because I find that in a 1-shot, and maybe this is kind of what you were speaking to, you have kind of this problem where you need to be able to convey a lot about the player character in a really quick amount of time without like banging on too much about backstory and stuff. And that's kind of where drives come in, and at least in the trophy context. The drives are a sort of like focusing tool. They let you like really focus in on what you want to say about your character, and you can always kind of use them as a touchstone throughout the story in order to develop the character's backstory and kind of what their deal is. I really love the one that's to prove to your now dead father that they raised a real rattlesnake.
That's the best one, isn't it?
It's the best one, right?
So much buried in it, isn't it?
It's a hard character framing, right? It's like, this is what my character is.
And sorry, just to pull this out to a broader adventure structure thing as well. If you were to draw a traditional local hex map of this adventure, it wouldn't look like much. It's a fairly straightforward point crawl. One town, another town, a gold mine,
right? Yeah,
an arroyo, a cemetery. But these drives get callbacks throughout the adventure. You know, if you're the hedonist, Ring 3 is for you. Plenty of options. You can stumble across a family who've got is it the deed to a patch of land? So if you're the guy who wants land, here's your hook, here's your possible out or your possible reason to keep going, so you've got a budget for it. On a first read through, I don't think I spotted that. I was just like, oh yeah, this is a classic little roadside encounter with a dead pioneer family. But when it came up in play and the player went, oh, I'm going to take that, I need that, I thought, oh, that's very clever, good. So yeah, it's not just a bit of character generation and then turning it loose. These things do crop up later. It's not just the author ticking off the boxes basically and then considering it done. Yeah.
There's a need to get like a character realized really quickly. I think these character creation options do a great job with that. And you're right. It's sort of thematically and even like situationally carried through the adventure, which is really terrific. I like the moments quite a lot. I think they're a real standout part of this incursion and so applicable to just general adventure writing.
Oh, yeah.
Anything else you want to talk about as far as like big picture things you liked or structural things?
The conditions, which like, because again, like, you know, as I say, it's a fairly simple point crawl if you think of it that way. But the worsening conditions, and I basically just gave one to each character. I was quite liberal in their application. And this is a thing where, I mean, one of them is that, one of them is just alcohol addiction, isn't it? That's getting worse and worse for this one character.
Right, yeah.
One is that the player character appears to be just dying or possibly already dead and is being followed by carrion birds wherever he goes. And I forgot which is the third one I used, but they're all these very bleak, they start off bleak and they get like almost nightmarish, like unreal.
Yeah.
And the players love them. Like, they mentioned it.
Oh, good.
During the game, at the end of the game, then I saw one of the players a few days later at a different thing, and he mentioned it again. They were really into that. Like, it was pretty cool.
Good,
like,
yeah.
Because the thing is, I will say, it's a little heavy-handed, and that sounds bad, but it's not really, because the genre it's doing it's that sort of later period spaghetti western, including films like Four of the Apocalypse, where characters are journeying through hellish landscapes, really appalling things are being depicted on screen often, because it sort of starts to cross over with giallo and that sort of slightly psychedelic horror cinema of Europe at the time. So as long as the players are in for that, and they seem to be at the time, then it really works. Of course, if you were looking for some kind of subtle, naturalistic, I don't know, the sort of thing Kevin Costner might have been in the 2010s. That this isn't the Western for you, but if you're in for a kind of slightly intense, late period spaghetti Western, then this is what it's doing. And it does it really effectively, just because the escalation is...
Right.
The alcoholism one, I think, goes from like, you think you're a bit worried about the water, you think it might be poisonous, And then the next one is your teeth are falling out. And it's just...
Right, yeah. That seemingly heavy-handedness works really well in this context. In addition to all the genre things you noted, if you think about it, we're actually seeing these characters like in the last 10% of their lives. They've had like their whole thing right up until this moment, and now we're just seeing the like dramatic conclusion essentially. And so you kind of want those big moments, like this is the end for them, you know, for most of them anyway. Okay. Oh, I also want to talk about just the writing quality. I think in general the writing quality is pretty good. I know you have a question about it, and I do want to talk about that.
I could say it now, which is I think it's wonderfully Baroque. But sometimes it goes a little too far for my liking. But then again, even as I was typing this down in the notes, I realised I want to leave it in because I want to say what the defence is as well, which is that when you're reading this, if you get to a bit that you don't like that much or you think is going to be too much for the moment, for example, when there's the question about which one of you knew that dead body that used to be your friend Crowfell, like there's a quite long little implied scenario, and I thought, this isn't going to work right here. Just don't say that bit. Just read the bit you like and don't say the rest of it.
Right, exactly.
So I've ultimately solved my own question here.
Right.
And it's better to have too much than too little. So, but I did feel like I was going, there's leading questions and then there's writing a novel sometimes. But right, you know.
I had that feeling out too. It's definitely one of the wordier of the trophy things I've read, but I actually really liked it. I enjoyed it. Like, I found it to be pleasurable to read, and it's fairly short overall, so it was kind of nice to like read it right before I ran it and just sort of get completely submerged in the setting, you know, and kind of what it wanted to do. And so I really kind of appreciate it from that standpoint. And like you said, like you don't use all of it. You only use the parts that are like most interesting to you. But those other things are still kind of back there, kind of swimming around in your head, at least when I do it. Okay. As far as the rings themselves go, which of course are the bulk of the adventure, I have different thoughts about them because, interestingly, this incursion, I had kind of a hard time with it initially when I was getting ready to run it because trophy incursions are normally really tightly focused. They take place in one place, a little stretch of forest or a hole going into the ground or something like that. And this is quite geographically spread out and has a lot of very, very different events taking place. Initially, I was a little put off by what felt like a lack of focus to me. But having said that, ultimately, I just kind of ran the parts of it that I wanted to run to get the kind of experience that I thought the players were interested in. But I also think that there's a question of it might need more than like one session, but maybe we can talk about that later. But as far as like the different rings go, they are pretty different from each other, which is pretty wild to me. With a little bit extra support, you could probably like spread them out to be a whole session each if you really tried, right? Especially that third ring. But anyway, I want to get your thoughts just generally about the different events of the rings.
Well, yeah, I think the highlight for sure is, well, in terms of the rings, I think Ring 1 is just the intro. Now, it's a very good... It's like, it's a bit wordy. There's not that much interaction, but it's quite fun to read and to play the parts, and everyone just kind of sits around and gets the message. Ring 2, well, I didn't exactly use as written, so we'll get back to that. And Rings 1 and 2 are sustained by what you've done in character generation, basically, I think, and the moments and the conditions. You're introducing all that stuff. Ring 3 is, I think, the best bit of this whole thing. So you get to the town, and you have these... Basically, you ask, who goes drinking, who goes gambling, who goes walking around the streets. There's like sort of five, six different things.
Little activities, yeah.
And they each have a different set of things that happen, including, well, for the trophy player, these are questions where you just answer them. For other games, so the way I use it, some of those are just questions for me. And then sometimes it's a bit of a hybrid, like the one where it's, when you bet too much money, which of your companion's belongings do you put down as a stake at the card table?
Right, yeah.
So I just asked the player that. But then I did have him make his gambling roll, which unbelievably he actually passed. But of course it's great. It's one of those great out-of-character moments, because of course no one else was there, but the player whose truck had just been gambled for was sort of simultaneously delighted and horrified. And what happens to each character individually is they basically get approached by this dark shadow that is supporting the main villain and tempted, or like given scenarios in which they could take all the money, they could be the winner. And that's where it really starts the... What is the main narrative? Because the final confrontation, Ring 5, finding the guy you're looking for is not really... That's window dressing. That's a MacGuffin, right?
I think so too.
The actual confrontation is with the Dark Shadow and with each other, because it basically offers to support one of you, to give one of you the power, and you have to be the first one to say yes, and that's the one who gets it. There's not really even any mechanics to it, in a way. Like, it's just whichever one physically says yes at the table first is going to get it. And yeah, that was really great, especially by the time they'd been through this whole journey, all the different things that had happened to them. And yeah, I think those are the key things. The interesting town, the fact they can split up but still have a fun thing to watch each other do. And then that final bit underground in the mine.
Yeah.
And of course it had to be underground because it's still a trophy incursion. So,
right.
Yeah.
In my run of it, Ring 5 to me was by far the most interesting because by that time, the players had so much like input into the overall story that they were telling that our Ring 5 was really like distinctly our Ring 5.
Right? Like by this time, they all have opinions about each other in character and stuff, which is really good. Yeah.
On paper, though, I love Ring 3 the best. It's so cool. The Ring 3 is always like the let's learn about the characters ring, you know, like the introspective ring. And the way this uses classic tropes of like the old West town to sort of explore these ideas about the character is really fabulous. But in general, though, I found the structure really enjoyable. I think my player's favorite part, it wasn't my favorite part, but I can see why they loved it, was actually creating Bantam in the beginning in Ring 1.
Yeah.
They really loved that because you just pose a bunch of questions about Bantam, which sort of help define your version of Henry Bantam. Yeah. For example, what's the name of Bantam's horse? What physical mark sets it apart from other horses? What is rumored to be unique about its diet? The answers to that question had a direct bearing on the things they had to do in Ring 3, because suddenly we created this idea of like demon horses in the setting. And so now we have like demon horses to contend with through the rest of the story. The players really loved that in creating their version of Henry Bantam, they got to essentially like create the overall story too, which I think is really great. Ring 2 is just mostly just environmental hazards, although there's some fun stuff with the witch. Ring 4 is like the monster ring, like where you just have to like overcome things. And the minor encounter, it kind of comes out of nowhere in some ways, but I think that's actually what makes it kind of effective. Overall, though, I had a really good time with it. I do have some questions I want to go over, though, because the things I want to say now really lead into questions. So let's just do that. I don't think one session is enough. I have lately been enamored with two-shot Trophy Dark, despite the fact that we market it as a one-shot game. I think it's actually better in 2 sessions. I just think you get more time to sort of explore it.
Now you tell us.
You know? Yeah, I know, right? What are your thoughts on it? Do you feel like you had enough time?
I do feel like we had enough time, but I can also see, I think you can have, rings 1 to 3, and you kind of finish session 1 in the town getting ready to head on out, and then the second session is 4 and 5. That could definitely work out. I don't think you'd even have to kind of import any new material. You would just take your sweet time over things, you know, like I guess maybe make a bit more of the moments and things like that. Yeah. But because the module, incursion, whatever, does a good job of tracking the passage of time through the rings as well. Mm-hmm. So you sort of have what you're doing at night when you arrive in the Town of Resurrection is followed by, it implies you go find the members of Bantam's gang the next day.
Right.
And so that's sort of your split point for session 2, I would say.
Yeah. I just do a hard split at like Ring 2. Basically, when I run Trophy Dark now, I do introduction to the game, Ring 1 and Ring 2, and then the second session I do Ring 3, 4, and 5. And a lot of it's just like down to, that just feels like temporally speaking, like a clean place to cut it. But I don't think it has to be necessarily.
It does. I guess also you might spend a bit more time on the character generation as well. Because I feel like the Ring 2 in this scenario maybe is a little bit thinner in the amount of stuff that happens than most trophy incursions.
I guess it depends. Yeah, it depends. I mean, usually you just have to kind of deal with the environment. That's the idea behind Ring 2. You're just dealing with environmental stuff. This has the interesting like little witch or alleged witch hanging.
Oh, my guys were not at all interested in that. They were like, they looked at it, they went, anyone want to get out and check her? Sort of, we could cut her down and bury her. And they were like, nah, let's just go.
Let's just keep going. Yeah. But no, in general though, I think 2 sessions, I really think that like it kind of wants to breathe a little bit. That was my feeling on it when I ran it. I ran it and we had a good time and the story was good. But I remember thinking at the time, like, gosh, I wish I'd had just like a little bit more time. I felt particularly rushed in Ring 3. I wanted like more time on Ring 3, that town one. I was really curious about your conversion to Stay Frosty, but you've actually talked about it a fair amount, so I don't think I have anything else to add to really.
Well, there are some things I'd like to mention. So
sure, yeah.
Of course, I had to slightly recast certain items. So a bunch of miners with pickaxes versus heavily armed drivers in the quarry was not going to do it. So I replaced that with a sort of haunted, ghostly drilling machine with like robot drill arms and stuff. So that was very fun. But one of my questions is to do with the gravedigger stroke has decided he's now the sheriff, called Belly, who you... By the way, I've got to say, at first I was put off by the names of this whole adventure and the characters, but the more I thought about it, it's like, no, this is like those things where someone has just translated directly from Italian and not really bother. Like, for example, the other day I watched a film called Make the Sign of the Cross, Stranger, which idiomatically translated it should be Say Your Prayers, Stranger, but nobody bothered to do that. They just went word for word. So, and this sheriff guy's called Belly, and he is super fun to play. I think it's my calling in life to play spaghetti Western NPCs. Yeah. He's awful. He's gold teeth out of the bodies that were shot yesterday, and he's taken the sheriff's badge and has decided he's the sheriff. Yeah, so that was good. But two things. Firstly, the vehicular combat, like driving around in cars shooting at people in Gridlock, is a little bit unusual in some ways. So I wanted to introduce that earlier. So I had a bandit attack in Ring 2 that was then during the storm, and then like some stuff happened. Yeah, somebody's car got totaled, some other people took a couple of hits, but ultimately they drove these guys off. And I wanted to do that to get them familiar with the system, but also so they would feel secure in the car. And later, when they got into a cemetery gunfight with Sheriff Belly, which, by the way, bullets pinging off gravestones, Western classic. Someone, I think, literally said, let's never get out of the cars again, which was, So that really served my purposes, because by the time they get to Ring 4, they fight and just about defeat this big drill machine, the one that's down in the camp with them, and then they're surrounded by more and they have to press into the mine to get away. But when they finally get down to the staging area, they're following the trail of Bantam, he's got off his bike and walked somewhere. So now they have to get out of the cars to go confront him. And that actually really helped. It was a total coincidence, it's emergent play. But the fact they'd been almost dying all the time while they were in the cars with weapons attached, and now they had to just not do that anymore. I felt that really helped the sense of vulnerability, which of course amps up then the promise of power and protection from the Shadow Devil.
That's interesting. Yeah. I will say, as a side note, I also really enjoyed playing Belly. That was like probably, in terms of like just fun characters to play, it was a real highlight for me.
Awful. But I do have a question about him. There's a whole thing about him giving the characters a ride in his wagon into town that he insists on doing. The text seems strangely insistent on that, and I didn't really understand why. Do you have any insights?
Yeah, I don't recall exactly how I handled that, except usually the way I run Trophy anyway is just to say, now you're here.
Yeah, I just deleted, like, they've got cars. Also, they've shot him now anyway, so it didn't really matter. But yeah, it was an odd one. Actually, that feels like something that maybe was more significant in an earlier draft and still stuck around. I don't know, maybe.
I think that might be the case, yeah. Yeah, it felt like a thing easy enough to discard. I don't remember how when I read that, like what my thinking on it was, but I know how I would have handled it, which is just to say, regardless, you're going to town. So
yeah.
Okay, great. Let's go to the Chain Lightning round.
Okay, I've only got 2, so you go first.
I will go first. A moment. On top of a fence post, a golden bullet casing rests, pointing north. What is the name of the closest town in that direction? What's the name of the richest person who lives there? Which of their blood relations' happiness did they destroy with an act of parsimonious cruelty?
From the Dry County condition. You can feel your teeth drying out and cracking like a desert landscape, nerves sparking. And it could be that some of these teeth are gonna have to go if this keeps up, just so you can think.
This question about the alleged witch hanging from a tree is quite good. Her milky open eyes, what do they communicate to you when you make the mistake of looking into them?
In Ring 5, Bantam shivers, but his gun hand is steady, supported by a dark shadow behind him that whispers in his ears, clasps his hand, and guides his aim. The stories are true.
When you encounter the miners, the spectral miners in Ring 4, you may be in the company of a pair of outlaws, Amos and Snakebite. This introduction of the miners was great fun and play. Quote, then, out of the darkness, a thrown pickaxe, black as glass at a pond's bottom. If Amos is present, the pickaxe strikes him down, and he crumples to the ground in his buffalo cape. Snakebite will panic and be snatched up in the air by a cackling horror trailing flames behind it. If neither are present, the party will suffer all supernatural attention alone. Let's go to the expert delve.
It's summertime on Plus One Forward, the podcast powered by the apocalypse.
And you know what that means.
It's time for another summer series.
Hey, Rich, I got this PBTA spinoff game. I think it might actually be a book that mentions duels and dances. Are we supposed to read it cover to cover?
I don't think so. Wait, how do we story with this?
Learn with us this summer as we're talking Firebrands inspired games. New to Firebrands? Tune into Plus One Forward this summer and learn with us how these mini game collections take apart Powered by the Apocalypse moves and put them back together as a new style of RPG.
It's the expert delve. Now, listeners, because Tom and I are complete idiots, we decided we had the brilliant idea of talking about the Western genre, in particular, as it how you can use themes of the Western genre, yes, to put into your fantasy gaming. Western genre, Western themes in fantasy gaming. We're idiots because this is such a vast topic.
In fact, if you could see our notes, you'd see that individually the first thing we've both written is, this is too big a topic to cover, we're just going to talk about a small part of it. So,
Exactly. I will note, though, that I think that we are going to have opportunities in the future to talk about some of these about Western things in a more granular detail, like, for example, if we ever do Tomb Robbers of the Crystal Frontier or something like that. Also, we've kind of covered some Western adjacent topics already on the program. The statues episode where we talked about the picaresque, I think, is probably a good
wilderness things as well, I guess.
Yes, exactly right. And I think what's really interesting as I was preparing for this, which is maybe sort of what we're alluding to right now, is that to some degree, the Western genre is like all genres. Like, there's so many like subgenres of Western that it starts to like really, really like spread out, and probably just because like American film in the 20th century is like so influential in like so many other like parts of pop culture, you see like Western ideas like creeping into like so much other stuff, you know? So it's a very, very expansive thing. There's so many subgenres of Western. Devil Aim for me is one of those subgenres, right? Like Weird West is a subgenre of the Western. So given all that, I think for this episode, I'm mostly going to keep it at a pretty high level thinking about the Western genre and how it applies to fantasy gaming.
Yeah, I'm kind of similar. I was sort of thinking about elements of the Western genre that I think are latently around or already in fantasy gaming and how we might draw those out.
Okay, good.
I do want to mention one thing, actually. It's interesting that you mentioned the subgenres. It occurred to me while I was looking through my Letterboxd back catalogue of Westerns I watched. It's a lot. I think it's quite instructive to look at crossover Westerns like Weird Westerns and other things, because that way you can pick out the things that are Western-y about them, and that will help you to identify things. For example, there's a fairly obscure 60s Western called City of Bad Men, which is actually a heist movie set during the 1897 World Heavyweight Boxing Championship, which I managed to spoil for myself by accidentally seeing the result of the 1897, etc., etc. And the other thing that I will note, I don't really want to dwell on it now, I just want to note it up top, is I think it's really valuable to look at the mediocre like Western novels and movies. In the same sense, people say that bad books make good films, like Jaws, The Godfather.
Sure, yeah.
Similarly, I think not very good films make quite good games, because you're able to pick apart
that's
the blocks.
true, yeah.
Now, the good thing is, though, thanks to Wikipedia, we don't actually have to watch these mediocre films or read these average books. We can just go and read the plot synopses and go, aha, that's a good thing to steal. So I think that's worth doing.
Well, no, I think your advice about looking at crossover things that have Western elements is a really, really terrific homework for trying to bring Western genre elements into your fantasy game. That makes a lot of sense to me, actually. Okay, so my initial thought is actually extremely high level. When I say high level, like I really mean it. When you're looking at the genre of the Western writ large, I think that the landscape and myth are important considerations. And indeed, I think that landscape and myth are connected in a really like interesting and important way. The Wild West, to a certain degree, is like a romanticized American legend or whatever. But even more than romanticized, it's mythologized. I think for a lot of people, I'm not saying it's for me necessarily, but I think for a lot of Americans, the Old West and the Wild West is our equivalent of Arthurian legend. It's like founding myths about our country. And you have these like larger than life figures, Billy the Kid and so forth, right? Like Wild Bill Hickok. You have these like larger than life figures who their whole thing is like just the myth making that happened around them. They were just average people, right? Up to like bad things. And maybe they did some notorious things or whatever, but they have taken on this like bigger idea in our national mythology. And so that mythologizing feels like really important.
It is. And I think it's really interesting as well that I think around the 60s, something very interesting starts to happen, especially in cinema, right? So up to that point, I reckon the Western is all national myth making for Americans, and it gets exported and people see it.
Yeah.
But then spaghetti Westerns come along. And these guys are Italians. They like the gunfights. They have no interest in like the Kansas Territory or whatever.
Right. Yeah.
But they are taking, and you start to see Westerns become really reified, partly because that when you're shooting in Almeria, you need to keep the amount of recognizable things pretty low.
Right, yeah.
So that it looks like supposedly America. So it becomes even more mythological because it's increasingly untethered from, well, there are sort of two streams. It's increasingly untethered from any kind of notion of depicting the history of America or the national legend of these figures, or people like them. But at the same time, you also have this increased, you could call it political realism, things like the Zapatista Westerns, the Django movies by Sergio Corbucci and things. So this guy he's taking Western tropes and figures and ideas and using them as basically his message is pretty much capitalism is bad, here's why. But then that comes back into America, and now Americans are sort of twisting their own national genre to
Right.
to match this even more weirdly Greek heroes and legendary figures kind of thing. Then the tone of epics goes from being, wagon trains hurtling across the plains to being, lone figures riding across deserts and dominating the landscape by being one guy on a horse and all this. And so, yeah, mythological is definitely the word. Like, you've got two people both heavily armed in one small town, and there's your story a lot of the time.
A lot of time, yeah. Well, so I want to kind of get back to the landscape thing too, because I do think the idea of mythology and landscape are particularly welded together, married in this genre. The typical Wild West landscape is, to me, much more interesting when you think about it as a land of myth. And this is maybe where I think the fantasy application comes in. Desolate deserts and mountains are just deserts and mountains until you start thinking about them as playgrounds or battlegrounds for gods. I think this is why such landscapes have always had so much personal appeal, as I've spoken about on this show before. There's a sense of like something that came before, like a long time ago, and then died. And that if you try hard enough, you can make contact with that thing, and then you can become your own myth in a way. To some degree, this is what people who like struck out to the frontier are sort of doing. They are here to tame this vast unknowable space, right? And I think there's something very intriguing about that. Now, there's obviously lots of like problematic aspects of that, and maybe we'll touch on those in a bit. But at the outset, I think in the fantasy genre, a bleak, blasted landscape that implies something old, something that came before, and indeed is, in the fantasy context, maybe perhaps a literal battleground for like gods and myths. And then you as a person like trying to make your own legend in that space, that feels like really fundamental to the genre, at a high level, at a spiritual level almost. What do you think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that quote unquote frontier, who's frontier, but the setting of Westerns, there is that. There's also the fact that I think there's always an undercurrent that everything's so precarious.
Yes.
So the cultures or the groups of people, the communities rather, that you see depicted in Westerns, which are usually the immigrant ones, but sometimes native ones as well, are the ones who have a system that provides everything they need. Farmsteads that are self-sufficient, towns that have the stage coming in and they'll bring in, you can order fancy perfume from Paris. It'll take 3 months to get here. Yeah. But they have everything that will keep you in the way of life you are accustomed to. But you're only one mistake away from death by violence, wild animal attack, starvation, all of this kind of stuff. And I think a related thing in that is, like you say, the idea that something has come here before and has died out. Because there's always this theme of failed and broken dreams. Even in the really triumphalist Westerns of the 50s, often the message is, many people have struck out into this land before and they never came back, and something horrible probably happened, but we're going to do it.
Right.
So,
yeah,
and there's that. And to bring it back to fantasy gaming, basically, I would say 80% of dungeons are the literal ruins of somebody's grand plan. So, I think it tallies up really, really well. Sometimes too well in, as you say, the problematic aspects with some slightly uncritical showing up to somebody else's house and taking their stuff, stroke clearing their land. But yeah, there is, and I think the compelling thing is, like you say, I hadn't thought of it that way, but the idea that legends have been here before me, or tried to, and it could be me, I could be the one.
I could be the one. Yeah. And I think that's really important. Before we get off this landscape and myth idea, I'm curious, in the fantasy adventuring context, like if you were going to go for a Western genre flavor in your fantasy game, can it only be largely empty and isolated places? Can you do the genre vibe in a bustling city or town or village?
Firstly, you can, because I think the quote-unquote Old West was way more bustling than people picture it.
This is fair. Yeah,
and these things, a lot of these things actually did happen. I think it has to be that idea of isolation, which could be physical isolation is the easiest one to do. But yeah, you can still have these ideas of knowing that there's shelter, but maybe not necessarily being able to get to it, this kind of thing. Or going exploring. I guess Highlander is a Western. It's got a whole load of jewels in cities, hasn't it?
Right, yeah.
And again, these people that are... Well, actually, it's a theme I want to come on to maybe a bit later. It's the idea that the adventurers stroke gunslingers or whatever are a separate category of people. But maybe let's stick to the landscape before we get into that. But
we can go into people if you want.
Oh, okay.
Because I think this is a really important component.
Yeah.
There is a temptation to make people in this kind of environment or in the Western genre like simple or like yokels, especially looking at it through our modern eyes. I think there's that temptation. But I think that's actually wrong. My sense is that the people who went west were actually among the most adventurous, erudite people at that time. Now, maybe these are just the people who made it, or the people who get to make their, going back to myth making, right? But you do see a lot of correspondence from that time period, and it's often very philosophical. It's highly educated and eloquent, and it's like not what you think of when you think of frontier people necessarily. If you're going to create a fantasy Western thing, either as a GM or an adventure writer, I would advise you to think about this idea that the people who chose to do this, who chose to go out to this frontier place, or who chose to strike out in this way, that they may not be doing it out of desperation. They might be doing it because they feel like they are the leading edge of something new and big. And I think it's a different type of person. Now, again, there's lots of problematic aspects to that. Absolutely, 100%. But nevertheless, I think it's worth thinking about. I don't know if this is a great analogy, but to be the type of person to leave the comfort of the East Coast and all the things that are there in the city, and to go out into this wild, quote unquote, wild land, or this sort of frontier land, and try to strike out in existence. I feel like you have to be almost like a Steve Jobs type character. You have to have a certain type of mindset.
Yeah, you either got to be pretty confident or fairly desperate, or some combination of the two.
Yeah. I feel like you do the genre a disservice if you don't think about the mind frame of people who would do this, and really give that some thought, and all of its different implications, good and bad. I really love the TV show Deadwood, that old HBO show from 15, 20 years ago. And despite their penchant for a particular word that starts with the letter C, the characters are really, really philosophical and poetic and deeply intelligent. And that really appealed to me because it burst this 20th century Hollywood idea of what the West was like. I always found that really appealing, and it made me want to think more closely and carefully about these historical people and their environment.
Yeah. Of course, the sad thing is that probably most of those smart, interesting, and philosophical people are not your adventurers, but although some of them will be.
They could be.
And actually, that reminds me of, I'm about to get onto my 7 Samurai Kick, but I've just remembered there's a web-published game from many years ago. The first version was, I'm going to say, called Mutant Bikers of the Apocalyptic Wastelands, and then there's a more recent version you can get where the A stands for atomic. But I just always remember this note in it. All your characters are like bikers docking around the roads of the desolate Badlands and so on. And it has a little entry for pedestrians. And it says, these are the quiet little folk that live in the settlements that you're player characters blast through with their engines roaring. You sometimes see them hoeing a field or something. They're pretty bland. And they're probably the ones who are actually going to save the world, but try not to let your players think about this too much. And actually, that is at the end of the Seven Samurai, of course. They have this whole bit about how the villagers are the winners, and and he's talking about him and the surviving samurai. You know, we're the losers, right? We're going to go back to being as hungry as we were at the start of this movie.
Right, yeah.
But they're going to plant their fields, and they're going to raise families. They're going to build something. They're the winners. And that, I think, is a very important theme of, well, a lot of samurai fiction, but of Westerns in the main. Yeah, I think it is, which is that whole, if you pick up the gun, you can't ever really put it down. Live by the sword, die by the sword. Mm-hmm. You can't even retire like other people do. You know, how many Westerns are about someone who's finally got out of the gunslinging life and has set up a farm
right,
and then some people come to town? Because there's always someone out there, or there might be someone out there looking for payback for the things you did.
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Justice and revenge, or lack of justice and revenge, are a major theme in the genre and worth exploring, I think.
Yeah, I think so, especially because like in things like D&D, the adventurers and retired adventurers are a recurring thing. They are sort of like this separate cast of people. Actually, in that heist movie, City of Bad Men, that I mentioned earlier, there's this whole thing where they're worried about people trying to rob the boxing match correctly, as it turns out. But the authorities, they sort of see these two known guns. I think they've fled a failed civil war in Mexico they were on the wrong side of. They show up in Oklahoma City? Yeah. And the sheriff's like, oh, we should get these guys in. And the deputy's like, I don't know. But the whole point is, the consideration is that if we've got gunslingers going to cause us trouble, we need more gunslingers. We can't like recruit from the general population. Yeah. Although, actually, if you think about guys like Bat Masterson in real life, or these sort of sheriffs followed by train robbers, followed by sheriffs, like that seems to have some basis in reality. The fact that you would get an ex-outlaw to be your marshal for like a month.
Yeah.
And related to that, Zane Grey, like writers like that around the 20s, I remember reading this novel called The Border Legion, and there's this whole thing of these sort of capital G good, capital B bad categories people are in. It's like if someone asked you what Calvinism was, but you hadn't been paying attention when someone described it, so you just gave them this. It's like someone who's really good can't ever really turn bad, even if they hang out with robbers and do stagecoach holdups and stuff. But someone who's bad, well, they're always just bad. And the novel's heroine, she spends a lot of time agonizing over, oh, is this guy I'm trying to rescue, is he good and just in trouble, or was he secretly bad the whole time and I fell for it? Not his best novel, to be honest, but very interesting, and something you do see, like once you have clocked that in an early Western story, you start to understand a lot of the conversations people have in those like 30s to 50s Westerns. And I don't think I'd do that exactly in my games, but yeah, this idea that once you're an adventurer, you're always the one that, even if you're running the general store, you're the one that the townsfolk come to, like, oh, you used to kill orcs and stuff, right? Like, come deal with this thing. Yeah, the tavern owner being a retired adventurer is boring, right? It's just there so that you don't rob the tavern normally.
Yeah.
But if that is a non-stable situation, if the tavern owner keeps a sword under the counter just in case old one-armed Jack comes looking for her to get revenge for the time she cut his arm off, you don't even need to make a storyline out of it. Just the fact that she's nervous about that, and maybe sometimes asks you if you've seen a one-armed guy in the vicinity, that makes the idea of a retired adventurer more interesting, I think.
It occurs to me that the fantasy adventure genre, as we sort of have come to know it, it actually really doesn't deal much with revenge and justice.
Which is surprising.
It really doesn't, does it? Yeah.
When's the last time somebody insulted your honor and your PC went out for a duel in the street? Never, right? But that should be happening, because that would be awesome.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it's ever really occurred to me until like right now. I don't even think the classic setup of, oh, we got to the dungeon and there's another group of adventurers there. Like, I can't even think of times when like that had a payoff at the end, where the group that you cut in front of tries to get revenge on you. Like, that's maybe like the most likely scenario in a fantasy game, but you're right. Like, there aren't duels. There aren't revenge. You know, like, unless it's specifically like a bounty type situation, like collecting a bounty, there's not even really like a sense of frontier justice, and there should be.
Yeah, in certain settings, like you keep on the borderlands kind of area.
Because the further you get out from the capital city, the more like sort of
well,
frontier justice should be
Frankly,
happening.
pre-modern justice was fairly frontiery anyway.
Well, sure,
But
yeah.
But I
fair
take your
enough,
point.
yeah,
I take your
yeah.
point.
I think in a lot of fantasy games, though, we've managed to overlay our own modern day sense of
Yeah,
like,
we have sort of
justice and courts and things.
We
right?
have
Yeah,
the
even though-
town guard showing up in 20
yeah,
minutes.
even though it frequently makes no fucking sense, but whatever. Right?
Anyhow, moving on.
Yeah, like, but it's intriguing to me
Yeah,
that those themes don't come up often, and so maybe that's something to pursue as well. When you're thinking about like making your fantasy game feel more like Western genre.
One more thing, which is quite a short one, but just to bear in mind,
Okay.
which is the notorious cyberpunk-related quote, "The future's already here, it just isn't evenly distributed."
Oh,
And that is a
yeah.
key feature of Westerns in general.
Oh,
the railroad
yeah,
is
okay.
coming, one guy in town has a car, the bit where you all stop to look at the guy who's got a film projector,
Yeah,
just weapons, and also dying out ways of life. So,
yeah.
especially a lot of later Westerns are, you're a gang of fantasy adventurers, but nobody needs fantasy adventurers anymore. All the dungeons have been cleared out. I mean, sure, there's that one massive dungeon they say still exists, but nobody believes in that old nonsense anymore. So I think that idea of being shoved aside by progress is pretty important as well.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I'm curious, like, what does that look like in a fantasy game? Like, what are some examples? That you can think
Magical
of?
Industrial Revolution, I guess, but you're not
Yeah, I
allowed to
guess
have any of the
so,
cool
yeah.
jobs. But
Yeah.
I don't know, that's... I suppose it looks a lot like the scenarios you get in Western stories. So this place is being cleared for a massive canal, and a gang is being hired to shove the ranchers off it, and the ranchers are hiring gunmen, stroke sword slingers, whatever, to protect them. And then you get these sort of factions in a little town, that kind of thing. But of course, the trouble with that is it's a bit too transparently a Western. So it might be something you just want to... you just want to think a bit ahead in terms of technology, or I guess magic. Yeah, the elves have shown up and given magic crystals to some people, but not to other people, and that maybe is a fantasy equivalent.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's
interesting.
one that's hard to do without it being a little too obvious, perhaps. Yeah,
Could just depend on the setting too, I suppose. Like there are some like established fantasy settings that are where you could probably do a lot more of this. Probably depends on what kind of technology level and stuff you're dealing with. I do want to say before we leave the expert delve, though, that I think it's important in the year 2022 to be mindful of how a lot of the myth making and frontier sort of manifest destiny thinking like frequently steps on the dignity and personhood of indigenous people. I think it's way beyond the scope of this conversation that we're doing today. But, your fantasy game might not deal with themes of colonialism or displacement of native people from their land. But if it's something you're willing to explore with nuance and care, I think it could enrich your setting quite a bit. Maybe consult with someone who thinks about those issues and has connections to those issues. But I want to just kind of throw it out there. That's been one of the more interesting aspects of the Western genre as like time has progressed. It kind of going back to what you said earlier about like new thinking, like sort of informing the genre. I think this is one of those areas where like in recent decades that has happened a lot, not having the native people be like monsters and bad guys all the time. Okay, with all that said, let's go to the next segment. It is Companion Adventures. I'm going to change one of mine because I didn't realize you were going to talk about Seven Samurai.
I'm sorry.
It's okay. No, it's fine.
Well, we
No,
can
it
still talk
makes
about
sense.
the Seven Samurai because it's
No, it's
a good
okay.
film. Yeah.
I have a backup one.
Okay.
I have a backup one. I do want to mention a couple things, though. Gauntlet Publishing is putting out a thing called The Between Ghosts of El Paso, which is a spin-off of my game The Between, which takes place in El Paso just before the railroad came through. And it's about ghosts. And the full campaign of that will be out by the time you hear this. Also, my YouTube playthrough of Devil Aim For Me is up. I wish I'd done it in 2 sessions, but it's still pretty good, I think. Okay, recommendations. Tom, what do you got?
Oh yeah, let's talk about films. Just the film I'm just recommending to everyone in general anyway at the moment, because I saw it fairly recently, is Bacurau. It's a Brazilian film from 2019. Not really a crossover Western, but all the reviewers cannot stop mentioning Westerns when they talk about it. And you can see it's really hard. I don't want to really say too much about it because it's one of those ones. It's just good if you see it going in blind. I will warn you, bit of violence though. It's like this little town called Bacurau, and the sort of inciting curiosity is that a bunch of kids go to look in their school class at the town on Google Maps, and the town's disappeared and they don't know why. Then some unusual strangers come to town on a motorbike, and they find that when the water delivery truck arrives, it's been shot full of holes by people out in the countryside. And then it starts to get weird and bad. Also, Udo Kier is in it for some reason. But really, really good film. Yeah, just watch Bacurau.
I love it. I was going to recommend Well, I was going to recommend Seven Samurai, but also there's a TV show on Netflix called Godless. It was actually a limited series. It was like a 10-episode limited series, what we used to call a mini-series back in the day. Really, really great show. I loved it. Basically, it's about this classic setup. A murderous criminal gang is going from town to town, like terrorizing people. And they get to a town that is populated entirely by women because all the menfolk died in a mining accident. It's an interesting perspective. It takes a lot of Western genre tropes and remixes them and plays with them a little bit. And it's just beautifully shot, really beautifully acted. I just really, really enjoyed it. It was very good binge watch. So I recommend that a lot.
Nice. My second film recommendation is actually, I'll bundle this with the next thing, which is a book. So a couple of things where, we were talking about putting Western themes and tropes into other settings. The film is The Proposition from 2005, stars Guy Pearce as a bushranger in Australia who is basically sent off, kill this other guy or we're going to execute your brother is the proposition. It's more of a blackmail than a proposition, frankly, but of course this is still a colonial setting, and so you can see some of the parallels with the American colonial frontier, but of course it is a different setting, and the ways in which it's different, seeing these tropes kind of overlaid, are interesting, and it works really well. It's just a really good film as well. Unlike, for example, the Brazilian film The Killer, where they tried to do a Western in the Brazilian Northeast, and it just doesn't work. It's really weird. It's hard to explain why. Because famously, there's loads of bandits in Northeast Brazil in the 1920s. You'd think it would work, and there's a whole genre of films about cangaceiros, but it's just rubbish. Don't bother. It's on Netflix. Don't watch it. But the novel I want to mention is All the Pretty Horses by Cormac McCarthy. Came out in 1982.
I was wondering which Cormac McCarthy was going to get recommended.
Yeah. It's this one.
Yeah.
I know that there is a film. I haven't seen it. And I don't understand how Matt Damon is in it because the main character is meant to be 16. And it's about this kid, right? So I think he's on the verge of inheriting a ranch in Texas. But his mum is trying to sell it off because it's 1949. And people keep going listen, buddy, nobody wants to ride around on horses and ranch cattle anymore. Nobody's doing that now. So he and his mate ride off to Mexico to basically kind of seek out this dying out way of life and see if they can just get a job as ranch hands. And I think, they do later in the book. And then, they end up in prison. Somebody gets stabbed. There's some horse thievery. And it's a good book. It's Cormac McCarthy. If you like punctuation, don't go here. But it's, it's one of his more accessible ones as well, I think. Unlike almost all of the others. So, yeah. I think it's a good starting point for a McCarthy journey as well as a Western. Yeah.
Speaking of miscast Matt Damon, I three days ago I watched Purple Noon, which of course was the sort of original version of the Talented
with
Mr.
Alain
Ripley,
Delon.
right?
Yeah, they changed the
Alain
ending.
Delon, they changed. Yeah, it's they're both. I'm not sure how either of them are super slavish to the source material, but which is a Patricia Highsmith novel, but. Matt Damon is no Alain Delon. So.
No, Alain Delon's amazing. Yeah, perfect.
He's amazing. Yeah. Okay. My only other recommendation is the video game Red Dead Redemption 2. I would not normally ascribe the word masterpiece to video games because I don't have that kind of relationship with video games in general, but I think Red Dead 2 is a masterpiece. I think about it every day. I've played through the whole thing, and at least once a day I have a Red Dead 2 thought.
It's good. And it's
so good.
It's such an OSR game as well, because I remember Red Dead 1 came out, and I thought, do you know what, I'm going to go up to the hills and become a bandit for a while. But the thing is, in Red Dead 1, you never got hungry, so you're not really solving any of your problems. But in Red Dead 2, you can go hex crawling and just feed yourself and sell things and have adventures.
I love it.
Yeah, it's great.
It does that stupid open world game thing where Louisiana and Colorado are within walking distance of each other, right? It's really stupid. But the beauty of it, though, because it has a big chunk of
I forgive it because the Louisiana city bit, for example, is so different from the rest of it. It's great.
It's so beautiful. You get so many cool. You get so many cool environments. You get so many cool experiences, and the game is just super well researched. It feels that way anyway, and just the details are meticulous. It's the ne plus ultra of AAA video games to me. I just think it's so great. So just one of the reasons to talk about it.
Is that the reason for this whole episode?
Yes, exactly. With all that said, that is our show, listeners. Fear of a Black Dragon is a production of The Gauntlet. You can find The Gauntlet on Twitter at GauntletRPG. We have a website. It's gauntlet-rpg.com. And if you'd like to support the show financially, it's patreon.com/gauntlet. Tom, thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. Thanks to our infamous editor, Rich Rogers. And thanks to you, listeners, for listening. Goodbye.
Bye.